to Practicing Failure with Dr. Amanda Castle, where we learn about mental health, celebrate mistakes, and explore how failure helps us grow. I'm your host, Dr. Amanda Castle, and I'm excited to introduce my guest to you today. His name is Dr. John Reeves. Dr. Reeves is a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in therapy for professionals, students, and those grappling with climate anxiety. With a PhD in clinical psychology and advanced training from Boston College and the Boston Psychoanalytic Society and Institute, Dr. Reeves blends psychodynamic, attachment-based, and existential approaches to help clients navigate anxiety, depression, and relationship challenges. He is the owner of Forefront Psychology and serves as the Washington State Regional Coordinator for the Climate Psychology Alliance. Licensed in both Washington and Massachusetts, he offers teletherapy across all PSI-packed states. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Reeves.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
And do you prefer Dr. Reeves or John?
John works great.
Great. I'll try to remember.
Either one is fine.
All right. So I already mentioned this to you, but this is a new podcast. So you haven't had the option of listening to old podcasts to see what this is about. So as some background, I work with a lot of high achievers in my clinical practice, a lot of them dealing with perfectionism. When you are in high pressure environments, perfectionism is sort of what makes you able to succeed. But then it also can get disruptive in other areas of life. So practicing failure, getting used to that discomfort is something that it's a theme I return to with a lot of my patients. And then we kind of frame it as, how do you view this as sort of a science experiment, right? How do we strategically change variables, see what data comes out of it? How can we use that to then learn and grow? Because that helps us be less afraid, and then we can expand our world, new experiences, etc. So in that spirit, I'm going to talk to you first about kind of the common themes that show up in your work, and then we'll circle back to practicing failure as a part of life.
Sounds wonderful. I
any
love that
questions
framework.
before we? Okay, great.
No questions for me.
Well, then I want to get started with something I find very interesting, and that's your work with climate anxiety. Because it's a growing concern. It's very disruptive to life, both the anxiety itself, but also climate change is disrupting a lot of things. Down here, we just had the Eaton Canyon fires and the Palisade fires, devastating,
Horrific.
connected to climate change. So I love that this is something that you specialize in and highlight, because it's really, I think, validating for a large group of people. And I'm hoping maybe you can just start off with talking about what does it look like, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. So, I'm excited to talk about this because it is such a growing problem, and it's been growing for a long time. But I think there's also growing awareness, and also developing sense that it's starting to really impact the people that we work with. And so to really back up, the exposure to climate distress, eco distress, eco grief, whatever you want to call it, it can be really pervasive, and it comes from so many places. And us in the climate psych world, we often talk about the poly crisis, because climate change is inextricable from all these other crises that are happening. So like political instability, economic challenges, public health care, geopolitical tension, like all of these things contribute to each other. And so helping one area of that can positively affect the others, but not necessarily. And they're all really complicated. Climate distress, it's some people call it a hyper object because it's just so big and so complicated. We can't really wrap our minds around it because
it is hard to fully understand. And even if you read the literature, like the research literature coming out, it's vast. It's really hard to grapple with. And I don't think we fully understand all of the knock-on effects.
Right. It's I think completely impossible to predict, where, like what locations are going to be, more safe than others. And of course you can move to a place that's safe climate wise, but if there are, major droughts that, rise food prices and cause food insecurity. Even if you live in, some place that's, a bit of a climate oasis, you're still going to feel the effects of it. So there's really no escaping it. And so that's kind of gets to the way it impacts people and their direct and indirect impacts. And so the direct impacts are something like the fires that you mentioned, someone going through that and going through the trauma of seeing their hometown, potentially their own home being destroyed. That's a very direct effect, of course. And so there are these acute disasters like that. And then there are the indirect effects of something like I mentioned, the drought causing food insecurity, or, gradually rising sea levels, those kinds of things, causing more immigration, maybe your own displacement, those kinds of things. And I would also classify watching the news and just developing a general awareness that, as long as you're not living under a rock, these things are starting to happen or continuing to happen. And so, the stress of that, it builds and it builds and it builds. And so, that can really exacerbate a lot of pre-existing mental health conditions and cause its own, of course.
Yeah. So what does it look like when kind of the root maybe of anxiety is related to something so big and uncontrollable?
Yeah. For me, I often liken it to the anxiety that something like death causes, something that's unavoidable. And so you have to grapple with something that's uncomfortable and distressing. And of course, with climate change, there are actions you can take that make a difference. In the same way that, exercising and eating healthy makes a difference as far as your lifespan. But ultimately, you're not going to avoid death. And ultimately, we're not going to avoid climate change. There's going to be some impact there. And so a lot of it has to deal with acceptance and grief.
Mm-hmm. That really gets into building our own tolerance for discomfort. Because those aren't things that we can live in denial, but it's still true.
Right.
And that's hard to accept.
Right. I think that's a great point, is being able to tolerate just uncomfortable truths. There are so many ineffective ways of coping with this distress that people often use. That distraction's a big one, of course, and we all have these little distraction machines in our pockets. But some folks are unable to distract themselves anymore from these effects. And so that's often when it can become so overwhelming, especially if you've either been kind of naive or ignorant to these things, and all of a sudden you're being exposed to just how bad it might be. It can be really overwhelming and especially cause a lot of anxiety and depression. And these things, the acute effects tend to get researched a lot, like suicidality goes up during heat waves and in the aftermath of horrendous flooding or superstorms. But there's also just this rising temperature that happens with anxiety and depression and people feeling more and more hopeless. And that's a little more subtle and can sneak up on people, I think. And so, reaching out to someone like me or another climate aware therapist can be a helpful way to start to pay attention to those effects and actually grapple with them instead of just suffering from them.
Facing our own powerlessness is a pretty overwhelming thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you understand the difference between sort of functional, helpful distraction and avoidance that might heighten the anxiety?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there's this old saying in therapy that what we resist persists. And, when we distract from our anxiety, we're, in a sense, dealing with it temporarily, but it tends to come rushing back in the same way that, holding a dam keeps the water away for a bit, but it has to go somewhere. And so anything that you find, especially things that work quickly for getting rid of the anxiety or depression or whatever it is, tends to not work long term. These things, often it gets worse before it gets better. So, if you find yourself doing something that removes the distress, especially if it's just quick and instantaneous, it's probably you're just holding it off for later and it's going to come back.
It's just building.
It's just festering. And so something that actually deals with it, will often feel really uncomfortable. It'll often make you more aware of your distress first. And then as you process through it, it gets better.
which I think is a really good example of why like people who are doing the work of therapy are like, it's hard because you have to
Yeah.
sit in these really hard emotions
Hmm.
that we can't just flick away with our phones.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's such a, my sense at least, is that it's in contemporary culture more of a problem than perhaps it used to be. We had more opportunity for boredom and to engage with our distress before, and now it's just become so easy to distract ourselves
Yeah, you can be fully distracted from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep.
all day, and I've done it.
Oh, me too. It's hard not to. Um,
Absolutely.
so you're talking about kind of being more aware, um, climate aware therapists, and it brought up two thoughts. One, that our access to awareness is going to start shifting as research funding is being pulled in these areas.
Hmm.
And so if we are unable to be educated in these spaces, which thankfully colleagues around the world are going to continue doing that work.
Hmm.
Um, but it can also make things similar to what you were saying with distraction, feel calmer in the moment because we're not being
Hmm.
inundated with new information. But it can also make that fear grow because then we actually don't know what we're dealing with anymore.
Hmm. Right. Right. Things that have a light shown on them, we have to deal with them, but at least they're not monsters hiding in the darkness. I think you bring up a good point that the world is so internationally connected that it's
Mhm.
hard to imagine that there won't be any information available. But I could imagine for at least a section of the populace, as information gets harder to access, it just won't be accessed. And so these things will be maybe more of a surprise. These 1,000-year floods that aren't supposed to happen all that often, like they may catch people more off guard. And so I think the chronic stress of being aware of climate change, perhaps for some people, will shift to the more acute, really intense distress of having to deal with a flood that you didn't expect to happen.
So we don't get to skip feelings, the stress.
That's a good point. You don't get to skip it.
Dang it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you can buy an oceanfront property in Miami if you want, but eventually you're going to have to deal with it.
eventually. Um, the other piece is, you mentioned finding climate aware therapists. And it got me
Mm-hmm.
thinking about how my experience kind of through a lot of training was for therapy, you focus on the individual. What is kind of
Mm-hmm.
within the individual and how do we work in that? Um, which then with climate anxiety, and I've seen this with different providers, becomes how do we make you less worried about it?
Mm-hmm.
And that framing can sometimes take away from the impact that this actually is a broad concern that affects us all, and maybe some anxiety is healthy and warranted. Um, so, do you have any insights of kind of navigating responding to legitimate stressors while also managing like the powerlessness that goes with it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and you can edit this part out if you want, but I think we both shared a professor that had lots of quotes about limitations and
Mhm.
dysfunction, and the one that comes to mind as you say that is that dysfunction in a dysfunctional world is functional.
Mm.
It's reasonable to feel anxious about these things, and it's not evidence that something's wrong with a person. It's more of a question of what's effective, and if overwhelming anxiety is not effective for you, then something needs to change, perhaps in the individual. But of course, it would be a mistake to pathologize someone's anxiety about climate change because it's not really an issue with the individual. It's a pathology of society.
Mm. And that's a hard thing, I think, for some people to step into. And here we get into, I think, Western thought in psychology, where it was kind of
Mm,
born, and where maybe more communally aware cultures have brought insight as to how our contexts affect us.
mm,
And
mm,
having stress in response is not a pathology.
Mm-hmm.
For example, like women being classified as hysterical as they responded to misogyny, maybe not the most helpful framing.
Right. And, I would point out about that is that, some of those syndromes that were identified in the 19th century, largely in Western culture have disappeared because society changed. And in cultures where, some of those repressive cultural norms are still present, there's syndromes that present a lot like those early psychological pathologies that were identified, right? And so there's a difference that's made when society changes, and so as climate change takes over and makes our lives more difficult, I think we're going to have more. Eco anxiety is not in the DSM, but I could imagine something like it showing up as climate change becomes more and more pervasive and more impactful.
I totally agree. And it again gets into when is it, because a lot of our diagnoses, this gets us into a bigger discussion of
Mm-hmm.
a lot of our diagnoses are like it's normal to be sad at times. But when does it reach a point that it's disrupting your functioning and your ability to enjoy life? And
Right.
so eco anxiety would not in and of itself be a pathology, but if it's now starting to interfere with your ability to connect with people, to hold a job, to sleep, then it stops being functional for you.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Anxiety is this thing it's a really helpful signal for us that something's wrong and we need to take action. And what do you do when there's no action to be taken? Like, I'm not going to hold back a tidal surge, right? Like by myself, I can't do it.
Come
Nor can I
on,
change.
at least try.
I'm practicing my failure, man.
Getting swept away in the process.
Yes. But when there's no action to be taken, like how does your anxiety, what is it telling you to do? And often it becomes this overwhelming thing because all of a sudden there's nothing that you can do. And so how do you manage that? And that's a tricky question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I talk with people around like, are there ways that we can channel that anxiety into something? Because anxiety can give us more energy and more focus. And if we can use that, like when you're writing a thesis or a dissertation, that is a lot of anxiety. How do we channel that into the work that needs to be done?
Yeah.
But if you're just shutting down, because it's anxiety is part of kind of the fight, flight, freeze, right? It kicks us on to respond to a threat.
Mm-hmm.
But if there's nothing we can do, then where does all that energy go?
Yeah. Yeah. It becomes, I don't want to use the word pathological. It becomes ineffective.
Yeah.
There's a writer that I really respect, and she has a website and has also published a book now. Her name's escaping me, but the book is called Generation Dread, and she's a climate communicator and educator. And one of the things she talks about in her book is that often something we want to do is rush into action when it comes to climate change. We want to do something, which is very reasonable and something we should do. But also, if you haven't dealt with the anxiety and the grief and the distress of it all, the action becomes untenable. It's unsustainable because you find yourself like shoveling at the ocean and noticing that you're not making much progress. You're making progress, but and collective action is important. But if you haven't dealt with the grief of it all and accepted that your individual change will be minor and maybe you won't even see the effects in your own lifetime, then you hit burnout. You hit this wall. And so it stops. And so what she recommends, and I agree with this, is to deal with the anxiety first, deal with the grief first, and don't rush to action when it comes to climate change, but rush to manage your own feelings about it and gain some clarity and stability and sturdiness within yourself, and then go do something.
I think that points to the difference between kind of reactivity and mindful intentional choices.
Mm-hmm.
And mindful intentional kind of strategic choices are much easier to sustain. And reactivity, we tends to open us up to regret or burnout or things that Not that we won't ever have those with mindful choices, but it reduces the likelihood.
Right. I think that's a great point.
Yeah.
I think it's important that, we'll still have those things if we're mindful. It's not a perfect silver bullet, but it increases the odds.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm.
All right, we're going to shift gears a little, because another area that you focus on that I think is very needed and relevant right now in culture is working specifically with men. And masculinity has become it's always been a buzzword, but it is really having a moment in culture right now. Um, and it can be defined in a lot of different ways. It's very emotionally charged. Uh, and in today's cultural and political landscape, masculinity has kind of become a rallying cry for certain belief systems and political views. And so I'm wondering if you can maybe kind of talk about what this looks like and ways maybe it's helpful or unhelpful to so strictly define what masculinity is.
Mm. Yeah. And strictly, I hear in the word you use, strictly, I hear a lot of rigidity and constraint. And I think that is a problem with how the popular discourse around masculinity is presented. And it's not surprising that men, in my experience, are drawn to characters that can be quite problematic in some ways. I think there's an allure to these men that have become more popular that present a very clear, strict, rigid idea of what a man is supposed to be. And often that gets portrayed as somehow opposite to women and opposite to feminism. And that's not a new problem. There was in the 90s, there was this masculinity movement that, had some good ideas, but often presented itself as blaming feminism for something. And so there tends to be these problematic elements to the way men are encouraged to behave. And then when you remove that, often it leads to men not knowing what to do. There's this there's this listlessness. I recently saw some research, and I kind of hesitate to talk about it because I didn't read too deeply into it, but research that men who adhere pretty strictly to, the quote unquote typical or orthodox masculinity tend to, on the whole, have a greater sense of purpose in their life. Whereas men who have a more open definition of what it is to be masculine, or, how they present their own masculinity, they often struggle with purposeness, with having purpose. And so it's this difficult catch-22 because, of course, I wouldn't want to put men in a box and say, this is what masculinity is. I think humanity is so much more diverse and greater than that. And at the same time, there's something that's missing. And so in therapy, we often try to explore what it means to have a flexible definition of masculinity, or what it means to find your own identity as a man, without bringing along with it some of the more problematic elements that tend to be present.
I think you touched on something that is really interesting, is that sense of purpose. And I think there is a comfort that can be found when people identify a purpose for us. Then it's, okay, well, I can live into that. I can measure am I doing it right or not. And I think that's true in masculinity as well as like rigid definitions of femininity. Okay, I know how to know, I can see what this is, and I know if I'm doing it right.
Right.
And when you pull that away, then these bigger questions and the discomfort that comes with them, kind of pulling that theme in from climate anxiety, of how do you define or find your own sense of purpose and figure out who you are meant to be outside of other people's expectations, that's very hard.
It is. And it's so, like you said, it's so nice to have someone give you a definition or give you a rubric on which you can grade yourself. And, if there was a trustworthy authority, and if there actually was one definition of masculinity or one way to be, masculine or feminine, that would be very easy. But of course there isn't. And that's one of the things that I encounter with a lot of men, is that often we're socialized. So I'm a cis man, and we're often socialized to ignore our inner experience. Our lives are about the external. What are we accomplishing? What are we doing out in the world, both building and destroying? And our inner lives can be ignored for years, decades. And so, an analogy I often use with men is that so much of life can't be thought through. There isn't a right answer or a wrong answer. It's more like, do you prefer chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream? Like, nobody else can tell you that. You have to try them both and see which one you actually prefer and monitor your own feelings and preferences. And when you've been taught to ignore your feelings and preferences your whole life, it can leave you really disjointed and also vulnerable to those more authoritarian figures that tell you, well, you actually like vanilla ice cream the best.
That's an excellent point. And I think there's this pull to the easier of black and white thinking. There is right or wrong. You either like chocolate or vanilla, and you can't have both.
Sometimes you love strawberry or mint chocolate chip.
There are so many options in the world.
Mm-hmm.
But there is something just cognitively easier about it being gifted to you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a push-pull that a lot of us as humans have of I want the easier, but also I don't want you to define me. And so I both want it given to me and I want to push away at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. This brings to mind the idea, this idea that, like, quote unquote, men need war to have purpose. And like, it's very easy if someone sends you off to war to have a purpose and to have a direction or a goal in your life. But it's quite damaging too. And so I don't think that just because something works, right? Like black and white thinking, it works in the sense that it's compelling and we tend to fall into it. In the same way that if you give me a bucket of ice cream, I will tend to fall into eating all of it because it's delicious. Like, but that's not necessarily the way I want to structure my diet. And it's, these things aren't the way we want to structure our societies. Just because men are, maybe find some allure in authoritarian figures or rigid definitions, doesn't mean that that's the best way that we want to, live our lives.
Yeah, but then you just opened up, if it's not, how do we engage the critical thinking to find something better? And what if we all come to a different definition of what is better?
Maybe that's okay. I think there's just such a range of possibilities for what's better. And I think my work as a therapist with men is to help them decide what's best for their lives. Because certainly I don't feel like I know. I'm certainly not the expert for their lives. So that's definitely one of the things that I experience. And, as I think through this, this disconnection that so many men have with their inner lives, it leads to disconnection from other people. Because if you don't know your preferences, it's hard to know who you really jive with. And so men are extraordinarily lonely these days. And one thing that I saw recently is that, let me back up. One of the things with men and their loneliness is that it's been so amplified over recent decades. Like when I was a child watching my parents' generation, it was something like 3% of men said they had no close friends. That's now 15%. And so that's 1 in 8 men. It's a 5-fold jump just over the course of like 30 years. And so, if you imagine your life without any close friends, that's an impoverished life. And 1 in 8 men feel that way. And I can guarantee that 1 in 8 men isn't in therapy working on this. And so there's a large group of men out there that are very lonely and don't know what to do with it. And it's not necessarily their fault. Like, society is structured itself in a way that's very disconnecting. And a lot of these men have been raised to feel like they shouldn't need friends or they shouldn't need comfort or understanding or all these things that we all need. So,
and I would say that 15% are the people who are self-aware enough to recognize that they feel lonely. Yeah. And I think there's even more who likely are unaware that they would benefit from connection. And I think I love the word that you used, impoverished. because relationships are a resource. And it's a beautiful thing that can really enrich life and make things easier. It can also make things harder in different ways, as with any resources. But sometimes we don't know we don't know what we don't have. And if you've been raised in a way that kind of disconnects you from that, you may not even know what that experience could feel like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's tough. And this is really across the board, right? Like, so, again, like 30 years ago, 50% of men had 6 or more close friends. And now that number's down to 25%. It's been halved. And so even the social men, are having a more difficult time. And so I think it's like the whole range of men and their sociality is getting more difficult for them. And of course, I realized that like men have had it so easy throughout all of history. And so it can feel like, well, boo-hoo, they're having a difficult 15 minutes. Like, why focus on this? But, when men struggle, everybody struggles in the same way that, when one people group struggles, everybody feels the effects of that. And, unfortunately, I think with men, having difficulty finding purpose, being so disconnected, it leads to extremism. It leads to more authoritarian politics and support for that. Like, we're feeling the effects of some of these. So I do find that it's an important thing to improve.
Yeah. And I think our success as a whole depends on all of us finding ways to live healthier lives. And I think it's very tempting to dismiss empathy for people who are in more privileged positions, and that there's a lot of reasons for that are understandable and warranted, but it also can lead to shutting down communication and conversation, whereas empathy typically has to start somewhere. And if we want to talk historical men and women norms, women have often been socialized to be hyper aware of other people's emotions. So men sort of being taught they can be disconnected, but women have to be so good that they need to see the connection and do the work for them. And so helping men work through this loneliness, find pathways to dealing with emotions and being connected, ultimately also helps women. And so this is where like we need each other, not just men and women, but broadly any group we want to disconnect from. Working through together can also lead to much more functional outcomes for all of us.
That's such a lovely point.
It's harder
if you
work.
Imagine, yeah, it's hard work. And I think like you're pointing out, like women are often already doing all this hard work for men emotionally and relationally.
Yeah. And so if we're aware of that and then a man comes in and says like, I think I'm lonely, and we're like, yeah, no, duh. That's only going to serve to shut them down further and sort of cut off discourse, even though that anger might be warranted.
Right.
Because this female in their life has been aware of this for decades. It's like, that's still progress.
Right.
We would also hope that can then be reciprocated and that be a two-way street.
Right. It's a reasonable response for men to feel angry or depressed or lost and listless. Those are reasonable responses to the way they're experiencing their lives a lot of the time. And of course, we're not talking about all men. 1 out of 8 men doesn't have a close friend. That means 7 out of 8 do. And I certainly think there are some really lovely men out there. I hope to be one or become one. But for the wide swaths of men that are struggling, this makes a big deal, or it makes a big impact on the world.
Yeah. And especially when the group that historically has held power is struggling, that anger then gets felt by the rest of us.
Right. I think we have to be realistic that people who are in power, if they are unhealthy and unwell, then their use of power will be unhealthy and unwell.
That's a sobering reality.
It is.
Yeah.
One that we're all
So you mentioned
facing.
loneliness. Are there any other common themes that come up in your work with men? Purpose, loneliness?
Purpose, loneliness. I would also say and all of these are tied, and I think a lot of them go back to this disconnection from someone's inner world, but also disconnection from their relationships. But there's a lot of ineffective and potentially destructive coping that goes with these things. There's this saying that, again, broad strokes, women tend to internalize, men tend to externalize. And so, these coping methods that men use for, the suffering that they're going through often leads to substance abuse or conflict or violence, those kinds of things, high suicide rates. And so, finding better ways to cope with the distress that's very reasonable to need to cope with, or developing more mature defenses against these things. That's a part of the work too.
Yeah. And I think it's helpful to use the phrasing more mature defenses, because as humans, we will always have defenses, but can we move into ones that are less destructive?
Right. We all have to deal with our lives. And sometimes that means actually solving a problem or fixing it in some way. But then there are these range of responses of just passing time without making things worse, or helping ourselves feel better about the problem, that aren't totally destructive and don't make things worse. And so, developing those abilities too, especially in these things that we're talking about, like climate change, where you're not going to solve it, at least not by yourself. So you have to find some way of dealing with it that's not totally destructive too.
Well said. And you've touched on a number of things, from climate anxiety to loneliness, that increase rates of suicide. And I think it's important to kind of highlight, if we put these into deaths of despair, when despair is going up for economic reasons, political reasons, cultural reasons, not having access to the medical care that you need, various forms of oppression, suicide goes up. And those deaths of despair, I think that's where psychologists like we come in, and we're trying to move us as a whole, as a culture, all people, toward fewer deaths of despair. And that can be hard to stave off. So for you, what are some tools or strategies you use with people that kind of help mitigate despair, so you can sit in the emotion and work with it without coming overwhelmed by it?
Yeah. I think it's important to highlight that this is a life or death issue for a lot of people. It's not just a question of comfort or something that's minor. And all these stresses that we're talking about, they tend to be additive. They make each other worse. And so helping one stressor tends to reduce the tax that it takes on the other ones too. So as far as tools for helping these things, I mean, certainly a greater connection to yourself and greater insight into your own feelings and behaviors, and the way that you perceive the world. Yeah, that's an important part of it. And that's difficult to do on your own. I mean, there's lots of self-help books out there, but, I'm certainly a believer, and maybe I'm biased here, but I think therapy is particularly well suited to develop those kinds of things. But then also connection with other people. People tend to get more extreme when they're alone. And especially if they have these pseudo social relationships that they can form online with influencers, or maybe on Reddit, these kind of surface level connections. And don't get me wrong, sometimes they can be very important and very helpful, but they can often push people in more extreme directions. And so developing real life friendships and relationships with people is really important. There's a podcaster that I listen to a lot, Ezra Klein, and one of the things that he noticed in his work is that when he's on Twitter, he says Twitter tends to make me dislike the people I already like, and talking with people in person makes me like the people that I disliked before. And so there's something about being online tends to highlight our differences and make you cancel people, for example, whereas having a conversation face to face makes you connect and empathize with people, even people that you disagree with, in a big way. So developing those relationships is really healthy.
That's a really helpful, I think, framing from Ezra. And yeah, things that can help highlight our shared humanity benefit all of us and make us feel less alone, even when we feel or know that we are different.
Yeah. I was also thinking about our conversation beforehand, and I was wondering, like, what kind of books do I tend to recommend to the men that I work with? And there's not necessarily books that are written for men, but what I noticed was that I recommend Viktor Frankl's A Man's Search for Meaning a lot to men. And I think it's applicable to anyone, especially in trying times, more despairing times. But finding purpose and having some reason for living, even if you're creating it yourself in your own mind, that's a very healthy thing to do, very helpful thing to do.
There's a great recommendation and a good book. One that I've been meaning to revisit.
Me too. Yeah. It's not that long, it's very accessible. It's but also a very profound piece of work. So
I think a really good example of some of the things you've been touching on, of finding purpose and meaning. And we can do that within cultural frameworks that make sense to us. So your religious background, the cultures and communities you're a part of, those can all inform the values that you hold, can inform where your purpose is. But it's not something that's decided for you, that comes from within, and your ability to interweave those values and what's important to you into meaningful action.
Right. I would say that a mature purpose is something that isn't given to you by someone else. It's something that you've really considered for yourself and even developed for yourself.
And you allow to change over time as you change.
Yeah. It's a common part of psychological wellness to consider flexibility and adaptability an important component of that. And so being rigid in anything is usually not all that helpful.
Yeah. It can be helpful when we're in life and death immediate situations. But outside of that, not really.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, we're not talking about being wet noodles and being boundaryless. And, it can be easy to say that I'm just being flexible. It's important to have, conviction and to have a sturdiness too. But I think what you're referring to is, with experience, with new learnings, it's important to be open to change.
Yes. As we fail, we can learn things and adjust accordingly.
What a great teacher failure can be.
Which maybe is a good segue into practicing failure. And I invite you, to share with this next question as much as feels comfortable for you. Therapists tend to be protective of personal information, so share within what's comfortable. But do you have any examples of how fear of failure negatively impacted your life, and maybe how you worked through those fears?
Yeah, I appreciate the awareness that therapists have different levels of self-disclosure. And I'm sure as you do this podcast, you'll experience, or your listeners will experience a range of what therapists are willing to disclose. And for me, as I was thinking about this, the thing that I feared and made such a difference in my life was professional failure. And it was so important to me in grad school as I was thinking about this question. In grad school, we do this thing as psychologists, and you know this, of course, but your listeners may not, that psychologists go and they do a year-long training internship is what they call it. It's kind of like a medical residency. And you get selected. Essentially, you interview different sites, and the sites interview you, and you each rank each other. And, it's this horrific experience of, not having much agency and just kind of going where the lottery tells you. And it's very stressful often. And in my year, the year I was going into it, there was this shortage of sites and this, what's the word I'm looking for? There were too many applicants for the number of sites. And so it was very competitive.
That was building year upon year around that time, that everyone who didn't get placed the year before was then pulled in the next year.
Right.
And it was not fun. Yeah.
It was not fun. Fun is not the word I would use for it. I was so afraid of not getting this internship, which ultimately, if you don't get the internship, you wait a year. Like you do some other work, you do some more research, whatever it is, you go hiking more because maybe you have more time on your hands. Like it's not the end of the world. But for me, it felt like a very serious consequence. And so I found myself taking on so many different roles. And I had, a few different jobs. I had a research fellowship. I had my classes. I had my clinical practicum training. And I calculated at once that, something around 80 hours of expected work each week, and which is
That is so
doable. Much. It's so much. It was really burning me out. I mean, I was miserable. And, I would be pretty efficient. It was rare that I would actually do 80 hours because I would, do the work very quickly if I could. And, honestly, I probably cut some corners and, I found my way through it, but I was pretty miserable. And one of the things that I was very lucky to encounter is there was this older member of my research group, a guy that was in a cohort or two above me. And what he would do is, I think it was 5 p.m. on Friday, he would just sign off and he would be done with work and he would take the whole weekend off. And my experience of this person was that they had a really vibrant social life. They seemed to really enjoy their weekends. They saw their friends and their family. And I think I also dressed really well and his skin was glowing. I mean, this guy, it seemed like he had his life together, right? And I was over here
So he's
struggling.
the envy of every other grad student.
yeah, I think he was. And I couldn't quite go that far. I didn't let myself go that far, I guess I should say. But what I decided to do was that on Saturdays, I would do absolutely no work. And so from the moment I woke up to the moment I went to bed, Saturdays was my day. And of course, there's a long history of like Sabbath, for example, of people taking a day off each week. There's a lot of wisdom through history to do this, but I felt like I was discovering it for the first time. And what I discovered is that even though I thought I was completely slammed, by taking a day off, I got just as much work done, if not more work done, in those 6 days than I was doing in my 7 days. And so I religiously kept to it. It was very difficult at first. At first I felt like I needed that day. I needed Saturdays to do work. But if I stuck to it and went hiking and went mountain biking and spent time with friends, and sometimes I would start a fire in our fireplace. And just
Good clarification.
Just to be clear, I didn't become a arsonist as a hobby, but I would enjoy my Saturdays. And I've later discovered that this was, there's a thing called Parkinson's law, that the work you have will expand to the time you give to complete it. And so
I didn't know there was a law for that.
Yeah. So essentially, I mean, if you give yourself 7 days, that's how long it'll take.
I always describe it to people as it's like a gas. It'll fill to the size of its container.
Exactly. And yeah.
There's already somebody that figured that out.
Yeah. Parkinson's law. It's
law.
Confusing because of Parkinson's, the disease, but yeah, the time that I was giving my work would expand. And so when I shrank the time I gave it, I worked more efficiently. I also was re-energized on my days off. And so both, I think it's important to say that I was just as productive, because that's often the concern.
That's the fear.
But also, yeah, that's the fear. But also my energy was up, my joy was up, just my quality of life improved so much. And I would also say to any students, or especially psychology students, but I'm sure this is applicable elsewhere. But I realized that when I was applying for internship, having an extra line or an extra 5 lines on my CV didn't make that much difference compared to being able to reflect on what I actually wanted, why I was in this career, having time to write essays that actually applied to the sites that I was applying to. Knowing myself and having energy was much more important than having a full CV. And so I suffered a bit in my internship search because I spent so much time, expanding my CV rather than expanding my own inner life. But I also definitely benefited from having some time off.
Yeah. And I think when you're interviewing, a lot of people who are interviewing also want to see your fullness as a person. Is this someone I would want to work with? And so when you have hobbies and energy and joy in life, that also gets communicated when you're interviewing.
Right. I've certainly had the experience in jobs where just having one friend or one person that I really get along with, like that makes my job, that makes, the work worth it, makes the work not so taxing. And so when someone's looking at a job, they want to work with people that they actually like. And someone who's just beat down and burnt out is not as much fun to work with. And that actually matters.
100%. Yeah. Because we spend a lot of time with coworkers.
Mm-hmm.
It's nice to have people that are pleasant to get along with, and we can have something to talk about.
Right.
Other than work.
Other than work, importantly.
Yeah.
Having a life that's full is nice.
Now, my brain goes somewhere that I think a lot of people's now go of, oh, but if you could be that efficient in 6 days, imagine how much you could do if you also worked on the 7th day. And it's this kind of capitalist mindset of how do we make the most money out of this? And so how do you kind of, or how would you respond to that sentiment from people? Like bosses saying, I'm not going to do a 4-day work week because if you can work that well, then we'll just give you more work to fill the 5 days.
Sure. Well, I think first it's just such a fantasy, right? Like it's avoiding reality. There have been so many studies that 4-day work weeks or having, ample time off actually makes people more productive, more creative, reduces anxiety, depression, suicide, all these things. And so, I understand the fantasy of wanting to be more productive, but that's just it. It's a fantasy. It's not actually connected to who humans are. And so often I would say, if I was a robot, sure, I could do that. But, because I'm a human being with other needs other than work and making capital largely for someone else, that's not how I can actually work. I need more to life. I also think it's important what you bring up, that it is, this capitalistic framing. I think just understanding that there are other ways of viewing your life, that your life isn't about work or doesn't need to be just about financial success or professional success. It opens up different opportunities or different options for people.
Yeah, it really does. And I think the way you described it is like, oh, this is why robots and AI are so appealing, is because they don't have needs in the way that humans do. But it sort of misses, you circled back to like the purpose of being alive and how do we enjoy and savor and have these other experiences outside of just how much money did I earn in my lifetime.
Right. Yeah. And, of course, all of this it comes from a place of privilege. Like I have the option to be able to choose whether I work a lot and make more money and, have some professional success, or I work a little less and can still provide for my family, but enjoy my life more. Like, that is a privilege to be able to make that choice, and not everybody can. But for those who can make that choice, it's an important one to make. And it's an important one for the benefit of you, but also the people around you.
Yeah. And I think even the benefit of sharing resources. Like, if I have enough to eat, do I need to keep getting more food? Or maybe other people might benefit from this food.
Right. Totally. This is also bringing to mind, there's, in any group of people who want to improve the world in some way, like climate change, there's always more you can do. And so there's always this balance of how much activism, for example, do I do versus how much do I enjoy my life. And so, do I go to my kid's soccer game, for example, instead of going to a protest? Or do I don't know, spend my money towards my retirement versus donating trees to be planted somewhere? There's always more you can do. And there has to be some balance of, you can try to save the planet as much as possible, but if you save the planet and don't live a life worth living, then why are you saving the planet? And there's an argument to be made there, but there's importance to art and music and food and rest and friends that these other things can't satisfy those needs.
Yes. Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. That was very well said. All right. Well, John, if people want to learn more about you, or they are dealing with loneliness, despair, anxiety, these confining definitions of masculinity, how can they find you?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So I'm on social media as Forefront Psych. So that's 4 as in FORE, Forefront Psych. And then my website is forefrontpsychology.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this conversation today. We touched on macro systems, microsystems, the whole gamut, but you really have a breadth of, I think, insight that you bring to these topics is really helpful to hear, and hopefully anyone who listens benefits from that. But thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you for inviting me and for facilitating such a lovely conversation. This was a lot of fun.
I enjoyed it. So thank you to everyone who listened. And just remember that failure is a necessary part of growth. So keep failing, keep learning, and keep growing. Special thank you to everyone who contributed to this project. Consulting producer and editor, July Diaz. Producer and graphic designer, Ben Castle. Logo art by Josie Huang. Theme music by Daniel Rogers.